between them, they had at one point $130 trillion aligning behind the scenes with net zero.
We have seen an increase in these very specific types of disruptive protests.
But that's not really what they're protecting. Like, they're really protecting their own ideology.
Have you ever noticed that governments seem to have a reverse Midas effect? Midas, of course, is the Greek mythological god for whom everything he touched turned to gold. Of course, that turned out to be a curse for King Midas. But even worse is the curse that our governments suffer, which is that everything they touch turns to shit. To say it another way, most of the problems that governments are trying to fix are problems that governments made in the first place and are making far worse by trying to fix them. I'll give you a specific example. Housing affordability. Why aren't houses affordable? Well, let's start with the fact that governments, that's state and local in particular, restrict the release of land and make developing land very slow and very expensive, adding to costs and artificially restricting supply. Then let's add to that the planning laws, which place all kinds of requirements on building design, block sizes and specifications, building laws that add layers of bureaucracy for the builders, green laws that add enormous cost for marginal benefits, and even 30% or even 50% of the cost of construction is being added by some estimates when you put all of that together. So, why is there a housing affordability crisis? Well, the elephant in the room is government. And government has been trying to fix that crisis since then Prime Minister John Howard introduced the First Home Owners Grant 23 years ago. The idea was to help people buy their first home by giving them $7,000, which, let's not forget, $7,000 was worth a lot more back then than it is now. Thanks for the inflation, government. But here's the catch. Government caused housing to become unaffordable by increasing costs and restricting supply so that there wasn't enough supply to meet demand, and its solution was to increase demand and make the imbalance even worse. It's no surprise that since the introduction of grants to incentivize buyers, the housing affordability situation has gotten worse. Much worse. Of course it has. Government made the problem, and government fixing the problem is only making it worse. But if you think it's bad now, hold on to your hats, because the government has found a new way to fix housing affordability, a way that is going to make housing unavailable, not just unaffordable. The new popular scapegoat for housing affordability is landlords. The narrative goes that it's because of those pesky investors that you can't afford to buy your own home. Not the government restricting supply or making subdivision and construction so expensive. No. The government gets off scot-free in this new narrative. It's all about those evil, rich investors. So state after state, we're seeing new regulations and costs being imposed on landlords, from restrictions on rent increases to new inspection requirements to new taxes. Those evil landlords are copying it from all sides. The theory is that if landlords start selling their investment properties, then more people will be able to buy a house, turning renters into homeowners. Except that they won't. Think about people who are renting. Are they in a position to buy? Would they suddenly be in a position to buy even if prices fell? Some would, yes. There's always people at the margin who are only just outside of home ownership reach. But if prices drop slightly, yes, it will help a small slice of people, but most would not. Most renters either prefer renting instead of the commitment of buying, or they rent because they can't qualify for finance or don't have a deposit, or don't think they'll be living in the area for very long, so they don't really want to buy anyway, and quite possibly, they actually don't have the income to pay off a mortgage, which meant that even if we did just give them a mortgage on their own home, that home would become a prison, a financial prison. To put it another way, landlords pay for the construction, financing and maintenance on homes that their tenants would otherwise not be able to live in. To put it yet another way, and to really piss some people off, landlords are privately subsidising the living expenses of their tenants in the biggest multi-billion-dollar privately funded welfare scheme in Australia. That's right. The biggest welfare scheme in Australia is privately funded by these evil investors. Wrap your head around that one. And there's something that always happens when government steps in to make something affordable, and that is that it becomes unavailable. I first saw this with my own eyes when I travelled to Venezuela in 2015, where price controls on common household items had caused shopkeepers to refuse to restock. If they were required to lose money on every roll of toilet paper they sold, they would simply stop selling toilet paper. The thing that was unaffordable became unavailable overnight because the government tried to fix the problem. And this is exactly what's happening on a massive scale in Australia with housing right now. Thanks to the prevailing economic conditions, that there's no doubt there's some headwinds there, but also thanks to the concerted effort from governments to make being a landlord unattractive. New construction approvals are falling through the floor. By January of this year, construction approvals were the lowest they've been in 10 years, with New South Wales falling near 50% from its peak. That's continued since, and even the ABC are having to report on the crisis and the fact that it's going to hurt, wait for it, renters. Of course it is, because if landlords and investors stop funding the construction of houses in new estates, then renters can't afford to buy those houses themselves, or at the very least can't qualify for finance on, then who will? The only thing that was keeping lower socioeconomic families, that's home leavers, itinerant workers, immigrants, housed, was private sector investors paying for the construction of those houses. And yes, in the very short term, maybe you could argue that bullying those investors into selling will make some more houses available and allow a small percentage of renters to be able to afford to buy. But that small upside for those that are at that margin will come at a massive cost to everyone further down the socioeconomic chain. Forget unaffordable. This collapse in construction approval means that very soon housing will become unavailable at pretty much any price. And as always, we can thank our government for fixing the problem that it created in the first place. It was Harry Brown who famously observed, "Government is good at one thing. It knows how to break your legs, hand you a crutch and say, 'See, if it wasn't for the government, you wouldn't be able to walk.'" Or, as then President of the United States Ronald Reagan put it,
"The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'"
It's the reverse Midas effect. Everything the government touches turns to shit, which is why I'm a libertarian who believes the government should just stay out of the way and not touch anything unless we the people ask it to. We can't afford any more of their help. And if you don't believe me, watch what happens to renters in this country in the next 2 years. Then you'll understand. Well, on the one hand, we all agree that we need laws to deal with criminals and criminal behaviour, people that damage things or cause a nuisance. On the other hand, we need to protect things like freedom of speech and the right to protest, a very dear right to my heart and to my next guest, Rukshan Fernando. Rukshan, how are you?
I'm doing good, Topher. Good to be on here.
What we've seen from South Australia is a strengthening of the penalties for people who do the wrong things during protests. Can you give us a bit of a rundown of the laws that they passed? I want to have a chat with you about it because I think there's some nuance to this that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, sure. So they've changed their Summary Offences Act via passing it in both houses of Parliament. So it happened very swiftly. And a lot of this pertains to disruptive protests. So when we say disruptive protest, we always think all protest is in some manner disruptive. But this specifically, according to the government, targets things like Extinction Rebellion or groups like that do these acts where, in a way, it is a bit of a public nuisance because they are hanging off buildings, gluing themselves to roads. Their main intent appears to be disrupting. And that's kind of the way that this is framed. So that's why the updates come around, because we have seen an increase in these very specific types of disruptive protests.
Well, protest is something very dear to my heart. I was heavily involved in the protests against lockdowns in Victoria. You, as a journalist, that's really where you sort of rose from wedding photographer, wedding videographer to independent journalist, and some would say state hero in Victoria. You certainly get celebrated a lot, and rightly so. So protest is something that you and I both see a lot of importance for and value in, but you've got some concerns around these South Australian laws, and I'm seeing some people celebrating them because it targets the right people. As you've said, it's meant to be targeted at Extinction Rebellion. I think that's naive, but you've got some concerns around this.
Yeah, look, I mean, even myself, ideologically, in terms of my views of these kind of protesters, I would say this seems like a good thing on the face of it. And I understand why it's being done as well.
Sure.
But the problem that I have is really we have seen how these things in the future might be misused by governments for other purposes. And I think that's where a lot of the concerns around this comes in from the conservative side of politics. I think the people that are supporting the rights of these climate protesters to cause this kind of disruption, they're looking at it from their ideological standpoint that they have a right to cause this type of disruption because it raises awareness of their particular views. I'm looking at it more from the perspective of how can governments in the future abuse such a power. And, we're not very sure, the last couple of years has made me very nervous about how laws are interpreted when, things hit the fan. So that's where really my concern comes in.
Yeah, well, you're certainly preaching to the converted there. I'm still fighting criminal charges from what, in my opinion, is the abuse of incitement laws in Victoria. So I get where you're coming from. I would push back a little bit, though, and say there is a difference between protest and vandalism, let's say. I mean, if we allowed someone to do anything in the name of protest, then all you'd have to do is wear a political slogan when you rob a bank, and you're protected, right? It was a political protest. Well, we have to hold people accountable for their actions. What it comes down to me is do you actually trust people to do the right thing with laws like this? And I think that's where the concern you're raising is very, very valid.
That's right. Like, is there other mechanisms where this can be kind of dealt with? Rules and stuff around road safety, or people's access to being on the road, for instance. Like, is there laws around that? Why does it specifically need to be structured around laws relating to protests?
Right.
Because in essence, what is a disruption? Is a disruption something where people are protesting during, let's say, a health emergency, and the government says the interpretation of the disruption is that these people are disrupting the rollout of the vaccine? Yeah. I mean, I'm talking very hypothetically here, but you understand how these things can be interpreted in this manner. Now, I'm not saying specifically that this is what's going to happen, but this is kind of the point that I think people who are concerned about this are making.
And I think there's, I beg your pardon, I think there's a good reason to be concerned given what we've seen in the last few years. You're absolutely right. And there is an element to be careful what you wish for. These people that are celebrating saying, oh yes, it's targeting Extinction Rebellion, and they celebrate it because of their own partisan political views. Well, of course, this is not always going to be the case. You're not always going to have a government that is necessarily on your side, so to speak. Anytime.
And I just want to make it clear, this was supported both by the Labor and Liberal government. So it's a Labor government in South Australia right now. The Liberal government are claiming that they actually came up. Liberal Party, are claiming that they actually came up with this thing. So give us credit as well. So both sides of politics are very happy with this type of a law. So there is that element, and I think there would be people in the community that might support something like this. But what you just alluded to before, be careful what you wish for.
Be careful what you wish for, indeed. Look, it's one to watch. Thank you so much, Rukshan Fernando.
Thanks, Topher.
Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we've discussed the UN, the World Economic Forum, and these multinational, supranational bodies that seem to want to tell us how to live. But one of the questions that often gets validly asked is, how do these talkfests on the other side of the world really actually have any influence over the way we live? We didn't vote for them. Surely they don't have any power, do they? Well, that answer is complicated, and it involves our politicians giving them power which arguably they don't deserve, but it also involves them getting control and getting their fingers into our lives that are not necessarily obvious to us as consumers going about our daily lives. Joanne Nova joins me right now here on the Aussie Wire to help us understand a story here that actually has a bit of a silver lining. There's almost some good news here, but before we get to the good news, can you bring us up to speed on what are some of these levers that these organisations are using to try and get control?
Well, we've seen people like Larry Fink from BlackRock talking about how we need to change the world, be good people, solve climate change. And he ordered Australia a couple of years ago. He said to Australia, we really needed to stop coal mining and coal production and coal plants. And, coal was a real problem. Now, to put this in perspective, most people have no idea just how big these companies are. And BlackRock, being a $9 trillion asset managing firm. So they've collected everybody's pensions and superannuation together. Now, the people who put their money into super and pensions, remember, they never saw their money. The company put it, the employer put the money in. The money then gets shuffled through multiple accounts, and you may not know it, but your funds may well be under the control of Larry Fink and BlackRock, or it could be State Street, it could be Vanguard. I mean, there's a list of them. But those three big super behemoths you may never have heard of before have together something like $20 trillion worth of assets, and they all vote the same way, and they're the largest shareholders in each other, et cetera, et cetera. It's such a cabal. But, think about $9 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's $9,000 billion worth of funds under Larry Fink's command. How does one man get that much power? But the entire Australian GDP, gross domestic product, all the things we buy, we sell, the services we give, all of that in a year is 1.5 trillion.
Yeah, wow. So
So we're talking about a guy who's commanding, who's asking, and he comes along with $9 trillion to, say, Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison, as he did. And he says, you guys got to do something about coal. It's a real problem. Now, behind the scenes, I don't know what he said to them, but in November 2021, just before the Glasgow Climate Conference, so this is to give you an idea of just how powerful this pressure is. Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison put in net zero requirements for Australia. We suddenly got a net zero target. Now, remember, the Australian voters didn't vote for that. There was no point when that was an election issue and we got to decide, yes, we want this versus no, we don't. Or when there has been a point, Australians have voted no. And they said no in the biggest landslide election that there was in 2013 when they voted in Tony Abbott and said, no, we definitely don't want carbon trading and we don't want a carbon tax. Yeah. So we got one. Now, why did we get one? Well, Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison said to us the international financial institutions told them that they would have to raise Australia's interest rates by 1.5%. If we did not get a net zero target, because we would be just seen as irresponsible or something like that.
So this is financial pressure coming in the form of where they choose to invest or not, which countries they will actually, how they will rate them from a sovereign debt perspective. But also insurance comes into this as well. And obviously a company these days cannot operate without insurance. And this is where I think the story has a bit of an interesting twist on it.
Well, indeed, and that's where I'm getting to, because in Glasgow, just after we got our net zero target, it was announced GFANZ, that's the Glasgow Financial Net Zero Alliance. So it's an alliance of big money cartels, the big bankers, the big financial institutions, and the big insurers, the largest insurers of the world, and they all banded together. And between them, they had at one point $130 trillion aligning behind the scenes with net zero. Now ask yourself, how much do bankers really want to save the planet? How much do they care? Or is this really about money, power and control? And we end up with, if we just look at the insurers, for example, in this, a really interesting thing has happened in the last couple of months. The 23 US states have put their foot down because they've realised what the game is here. Sure. And they have written to all of those insurance companies individually and said, look, hang on a minute, we're not comfortable with you colluding. Even if you're doing it openly, nakedly telling us you're colluding, it's still collusion. If you meet and you have regular appointments and you all tell each other what your net zero targets are and how you're arranging net zero and how you're going to put pressure on people, and perhaps, we could look at a point where they won't be insuring coal, gas, all sorts of things, which we voted on, which are legal companies, which are things the Australian voters are quite happy about. And yet these foreign centres of money are saying, no, you can't have that. No, you can't do that. And there's enormous pressure. In fact, if we were looking at a one world government coming in, this is kind of what it would look like. This is one step away from that sort of power. And remember, we're not allowed to talk about one world government without being called a conspiracy theorist, of course. Unless you're Bob Brown or you're someone else.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Then you can get away with it.
One government is a good idea, isn't it? And then you're a hero.
So not everyone's happy, though. There is a perception that the mythical they, the people that want to take over the world, that they're all in lockstep with each other and in each other's pockets, as we know they are financially, and they certainly are very much on the same page in a lot of areas. But not all is happy at home for amongst these companies, is it?
Well, no, this is the really good thing. The fact that the US states are writing to these companies, and they wrote to the bankers before this, and Vanguard, one of the largest asset managers, second largest asset manager in the world, actually pulled out of Gafance because it could see that the antitrust legislation, which is active in the US, was pointing to the fact that legally it was going to be hard for them to say, no, we're not colluding with everyone in a giant cartel when they were doing it openly and their names were all on the list. So with the insurance companies, though, what's really impressive is lots of them have bailed, starting in March with, I think, Munich Re was one of the first to go. AXA, one of the largest insurance companies in the world, has now bailed on this NZIA, as it's called, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. And it's all come undone. And we've seen a mass exodus. Swiss Re has gone, Hanover's gone, and they've all literally left this burning wreck of a boat in the last 2 months, to the point where people are starting to talk about whether it is realistic to talk about NZIA surviving this exodus. So it really is much more than just a symbolic thing. They had something like 29 very large insurance companies in the world in January when they launched at the WEF meeting at Davos.
Of course.
They launched their latest round of targets. And now they're down to 21 at last count, but it was falling every day. So that may be lower than that.
Yeah. It's quite astonishing, and a lot of people lose heart. They look at the size of some of the challenges that we're facing, and I can understand how that happens. But I think it's really important to actually be noticing details like the one that you brought to my attention and brought to us today, that they can make their plans and they can try and execute them, but there are good people pushing back, and the conclusion is not a foregone one. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I think the US states may end up saving the whole world on this one because, yay for democracy, because they're the only ones who seem to be paying attention to what the voters want. And look, the big bluff behind this, and people need to understand what a huge bluff it is that Larry Fink and all the others managing these giant cartel these asset managing funds, they are using your money, other people's money, in order to threaten companies. They went along to Exxon board meetings a few years ago, and they managed to get sympathetic people elected to the board of directors. It changed the way Exxon behaved when they did that. And so they are putting through policy changes which are not changes that the voters voted for. Now, the same voters that voted to have cheap energy and no carbon taxes, their superannuation money or their pension funds are being used by companies like BlackRock to go along and wield as a powerful stick and say, if we decide we're not going to invest in your industry, if we decide that you're not green enough, we will abandon you, or we will recommend people sell, or whatever. And they're just genuinely afraid. As I said, even Scott Morrison and Josh Friedenberg would, I guess, in a sense, be justifiably afraid that Australia's interest rates would rise 1.5%. Suddenly, Australian taxpayers would be paying so much more in interest. But to me, the bigger question is, who's deciding these rules? In a democracy, shouldn't it be the voters who decide these rules? Why do we let these foreign cartels and bankers decide the rules for us? And isn't that the biggest issue that Friedenberg and Morrison should really have said? Like, hang on a minute. Do we really need to get loans from overseas? Well, at the moment we do, but is that a good system? So, these are huge issues going on behind this, and you're quite right to pick this story up as such a big deal. And it is great to see that, at least on the insurance alliance, that it appears to be unraveling fast. There's a lot more work to do to get to the bankers, but we've seen Larry Fink's changed his tune a lot in the last year. He was sending out a note to all of his minions, said there are people listening to him every January every year, his shareholders note, and it was green, and he changed his tune this year.
Interesting.
So he is now aware that, it's an empty shell in a sense. If everybody said, I do not want my funds used with BlackRock, the whole thing would implode, because BlackRock itself, I think, in net worth, we're talking 200 or 300 billion. It's a huge company, but it isn't 9 trillion. So most of what runs behind BlackRock is other people's money.
That's where their
and if
power
other
comes from.
people started to say no thanks, his power would evaporate, and that could happen overnight. So we've seen Florida and Oklahoma, I think Virginia, and states like that in the US, they have pulled their pension fund money. They've said, we are not going to invest your pension funds. We're not going to allow state-funded employees' pensions to be put into accounts of companies that are boycotting fossil fuels, which is, in the case of some of those states, like West Virginia,
That's
a big driver of their economy.
Yeah. That's how
So,
they survive.
you know, well done. And they're all Republicans, of course. These Republicans in the US are standing up for their voters, saying it is not okay that you are levering our energy companies out of business. You're raising the costs, the interest costs of, and the energy costs of our consumers. You're cutting jobs in industries which really matter to us. And you're doing it with our money. And so I think there was only $2 billion, I think Florida pulled out last year from the bankers kind of trust. But that was the start of something. And Larry Fink is actually afraid of that because, as I said, if word spreads and everyone realises how their money's being used to change what they voted for, then it will be all over. So
very
spread the word.
Look, this is such a big issue. There are so many different angles on it. I want to pick up again in a future interview with you the social credit score by stealth that we're almost talking about here, where it's actually been introduced by the financial institutions and not necessarily by governments directly. There's so much more to talk about. But Joanne, thank you. We're going to have to get back to this another time.
Thank you.
Well, here at the Aussie Wire, freedom of speech is something we keep coming back to because it's one of the most fundamental and foundational freedoms that you could possibly have. And sadly, in this day and age, it is a freedom that isn't exactly safe. Here to talk about the Victorian situation specifically is a previous Aussie Wire favourite amongst viewers and one of my personal favourite politicians, although I will say that is kind of damning with faint praise. It's a very low bar. But nevertheless, one of my favourite politicians is David Limbrick. Thank you so much for joining us here again on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for the nice introduction.
the backhanded insult. Look, one of the things I'm actually really appreciating about you, and this is going to be the second time it's happened already on the Aussie Wire, is that we get to see you in action, and then I get to interview you to talk about what's happened. So I'm going to start here with a quick clip from the Victorian Parliament where you were interrogating the Victorian Attorney General.
This government isn't unique in considering how to respond to hate speech, or as I would put it, the speech that those in power hate. For example, New Zealand recently withdrew their proposed hate speech laws to continue work trying to find the right balance. Ireland is right now on the verge of passing anti-free speech legislation that includes penalties, potential penalties of up to 5 years in prison. Scotland has passed their Hate Crime and Public Order Act in 2021, but it's yet to be implemented out of concerns that the police can't easily define hate speech. This hasn't prevented people, however, from being investigated in the UK under the Orwellian non-crime hate incidents. There are documented disclosures demonstrating that the police are keeping files or investigating people for posting on social media their belief merely that transgender women aren't women. Can the Attorney General provide reassurance that the dictionary definition of woman, that is an adult human female, won't be considered hate speech under the proposed anti-vilification laws?
Well, if you want to see the Victorian Attorney General's answer to that, you're going to have to go onto David Limbrick's social media and have a look at that. But David, it feels very strange to me that we are having to have these conversations in what I thought, until relatively recently, was a liberal democracy.
Well, you know, Victoria's always been really keen on clamping down on speech and things like that. So I wouldn't say that it's something new, but it's certainly a progression that's happened. Look, this particular issue, I became sort of fairly activated by it when I went along to that Let Women Speak rally back in March because I wanted to listen to what they had to say. And I became quite convinced at the time that this is an issue that libertarians should care about because there's some fundamental freedoms here that are being challenged. Firstly, there is freedom of speech, which you and I are both passionate defenders of. But secondly, also freedom of association, freedom of belief, and also there's serious issues around parental rights. And I think all of these issues libertarians should care about, and they're all under attack in this particular scenario. So the government responded to that protest by trying to deliberately conflate these women who were trying to speak out about these issues, deliberately conflating them with Nazis, and then immediately signaling that they would bring in new laws to we don't know do exactly what. They say, anti-vilification laws. I'm worried that what they're really trying to do is silence dissent to a dominant ideology.
Well, I'm on the receiving end, of course, of incitement charges because they wanted to silence my dissent from the dominant ideology during the COVID era. I can't help but agree that there does seem to be a push. They enjoyed that taste of power and the ability to misuse criminal charges against people who are simply speaking out. And it looks to me like they want that going forward on all issues, or certainly on more. We've seen in the UK, according to Constantine Kissin of the Trigonometry podcast, over 4,000 arrests in just a 12-month period in the UK over speech, things that people had posted online and that sort of thing, including in some cases prison sentences and criminal records and all sorts of things like that. How do we find ourselves in a situation where we look like we're going to repeat mistakes that have been made around the world? How do we learn these lessons so that we don't repeat these mistakes here?
Well, I think highlighting them is a good start, and also waking people up to the idea that what the government narrative is like they're basically saying, "Oh, look, we're just trying to silence Nazis." That's absolute nonsense. They're trying to silence women, and that's why I thought I'd highlight it by by asking for assurances that something as simple as the dictionary definition of a woman, adult human female, not become hate speech, as they call it, or as I would say, speech that those in power hate. That we need people to understand that they are not trying. They say that they're trying to protect vulnerable communities and stuff like this, and everyone wants to protect vulnerable communities, of course. But that's not really what they're protecting. Like, they're really protecting their own ideology from dissent and discussion. Because what I saw back in March was not a debate, not people with differing views. I saw some people who wanted to speak out their views, and then everyone else wanted to silence them. They wanted to shut it down.
Now, it's very, very concerning, and this is a creeping return of something that I thought that Western culture had dealt with in the first half of last century, but it seems like some of these ideas are coming back, that we silence those we disagree with rather than engaging and bringing better ideas to the table. Well, David Limbrick, I'm very, very grateful that you're in the Victorian Parliament. You're fighting the good fight. You're one of a handful of good people in there. We saw a few others actually in the background of the footage that we were just playing before as you were speaking on the floor of Parliament House. And I look forward to future interviews with you. I wish you all the best in this particular fight. We certainly need to be standing up for free speech now more than ever before.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for watching The Aussie Wire. I'm Topher Field, and you can support us at theaussiewire.locals.com/support. The link is in the description. You can find past episodes at theaussiewire.com, and you can find us on all the socials at The Aussie Wire. New episodes of The Aussie Wire News are released every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. I'll see you next time on The Aussie Wire.